The government claims it will still reach the target to reduce Australia's carbon emissions by 5% by 2020 with its direct action policy, which is more carrot than stick to try and get heavy carbon polluters to reduce their emissions. Now, on the other big news that happened today, the anti-terror laws, another tranche of which were passed today, the government is saying Australia is facing a grave threat here, as many young Australians are joining the fight. And also today was the Abbott government's second red tape repeal day, with plans to repeal nearly 1,000 pieces of legislation and regulation to supposedly bring net savings of over $2.1 billion since they've been in office. Now, I spoke to Parliamentary Secretary Josh Frydenberg about all these issues just a little earlier. Josh Frydenberg, thanks very much for joining us.
Nice to be with you, Helen.
Now, the government has done a deal with Clarke Palmer, his senators and a couple of others to get your controversial direct action plan up. This was a policy that Clarke Palmer himself called hopeless and it would never work just a few months ago. Doesn't that severely dent the credibility of this direct action policy?
Oh, not at all. This is a great deal for the environment, a great deal for Australians and a great deal for the government and also the Palmer United Party, because what we actually are putting in place is $2.55 billion worth of measures to find the lowest cost of abatement. It's a much better alternative than the carbon tax or anything that the Labor Party has or will put forward. And there's already 170 projects in place, Helen, which are looking at how to build efficiency in commercial buildings, how to get the waste gas out of coal mines, how to get more efficient power stations. These are the type of measures which the Direct Action Plan will fund, and in doing so we will meet our target of a 5% reduction on emissions by 2020 from 2000 levels.
Did you, in a sense, buy off Clarke Palmer, getting his support for, in turn, you agreeing to just a review, an inquiry into his version of an ETS? That seemed like a small price for you to pay to get the support of the man who said he thought it was a hopeless policy.
Oh, well, that's a question you have to direct towards Clive. Our position on the ETS and the carbon tax has certainly not changed, and we believe that the Direct Action Plan is a good outcome, but we have shown the Australian people that we can deal with the Palmer United Party in the Senate. We got a deal on our Green Army. We got a deal for the abolition of the carbon tax. We got a deal for the abolition of the mining tax. We made some changes to the future of financial advice. We have shown, even in the difficult circumstances in which we find ourselves with a minority position in the Senate, that we can get good, practical outcomes for the Australian people. That's what they expect of us, and that's what we've delivered yet again.
Josh Frydenberg, your government is making much of the removal of red tape. Why is this so important, and how much have you actually removed?
Well, we've actually announced $2.1 billion worth of compliance savings. That's extremely significant right across the economy, from education to health, from agriculture to finance, from Treasury to trade, every portfolio. And we've got some significant bills already through the Senate, including our changes to the agricultural and veterinary chemical system, to the classification system, to on an omnibus bill, on the future of financial advice, all important deregulatory measures. So we've actually announced $2.1 billion worth of savings. That's a doubling, Helen, of our target. There are more than 400 individual measures. In the bills that went through the House today, we're getting rid of nearly 1,000 pieces of legislation and regulation, abolishing more than 7,200 pages from the statute books. This is on top of our achievements in March, when we got rid of 10,000 pieces of regulation legislation, and the lives of individuals, families, small businesses and the not-for-profit sector will be a lot easier. I mean, take, for example, 32,500 small businesses, Helen, who currently don't pay any GST. Well, they'll no longer need to submit a BAS statement. Or 430,000 small businesses that have minimal income that submit a BAS statement, they'll no longer have to go through the PAYG tax system. There are significant changes in terms of removing the burden on small businesses, which we know are the backbone of the economy.
How can the community know that in some of the red or the green tape removal that you're not lessening the safeguards for the community, say particularly on environmental protections, that you're not wiping away those safeguards by taking away the red or the green tape, as you call it?
Well, you're right. It requires a delicate balancing act, but we're very confident that we are achieving that. On the environment space, we've actually reached agreements with all states and territories on a one-stop shop environmental approval process. So we will delegate some of our authority down to the state level, but maintain the high environmental standards. There won't be any diminution in those standards. You see, the problem, as we find so often in this red tape area, Helen, is that companies having to go through duplicative processes at both federal and state level. And that is there's no better example of that than in terms of environmental approvals, where one company wanted to make $1 billion investment in the resource sector in Australia. It sought an environmental approval, and that process took them more than 2 years. It cost them more than $20 million. It required 4,000 meetings, a 12,000-page report, and then when the approval came through, it had 1,500 conditions attached, 300 at the federal level, 1,200 at the state level, and 8,000 sub-conditions. Now, you know as well as I do that companies are not very sentimental. You know, capital is mobile. Australia is not the only country in the world producing iron ore, coal, uranium and gold. Investments will go elsewhere if we don't have an environment in Australia which is conducive to quicker decisions, but just as good decisions.
Just turning to the national security issue, obviously that's been a huge one today, the foreign fighters legislation going through. Reports that the most senior Australian who supposedly has a position in the IS terrorist group, that he's dead. What more can you tell us about that, and how many young Australians does the government believe have gone to Iraq and Syria to fight? The reports from the Foreign Minister suggest she knows or thinks there are 130 plus. Are they all overseas?
Well, they're not all overseas. We're saying publicly that at least 70 Australians have gone to fight in Syria and Iraq. Another 100 plus are actually providing support for them one way or another, either over there or here in Australia. The Foreign Minister's cancelled...
So the total figure's now gone to 170?
Yes.
From 130?
Well, in terms of those who are over there, it's at least 70, and in terms of those who are providing support, it's around 100, whether it's here or over there. There's also been the cancellation of more than 70 passports, as the Foreign Minister has indicated to the Parliament. I mean, the bottom line here, Helen, is there is a serious threat. There's a serious threat from, Islamic extremism, which finds its latest manifestation in ISIL or ISIS. And the beheadings and the butchery and the attempted genocides that we have seen is something that is abhorrent to Australians and to the world. And
all right, but do you know, Josh, do you know how many Australians have died in this fighting or in a conflict overseas not sanctioned by the government?
Well, I'll leave that to Julie Bishop to put a final number on that, or the Prime Minister, but we do know there's been a number of Australians who have been suicide bombers in Syria and Iraq, and obviously they've lost their lives taking the lives of others. So there has been Australian casualty. Well, I know of at least two, or I think there might have been a third, suicide bomber over there, which is a great concern.
Are any women or girls among those who've gone and done that you know of?
Well, look, I'll leave that sort of detail to the Foreign Minister and to the Prime Minister, but
well, you've just told us 2 or 3. Are any of them women or girls?
But Helen, those numbers are in the public realm. They've been repeated many a time publicly.
Yeah.
I don't know who they were.
So I'm just wondering, are any of them girls? Okay.
I can't answer that one for you.
So what is the likely outcome for these young people? Will they ever come back to Australia, or is it likely they will die overseas?
Well, as you know, it's an offence to participate in these overseas terrorist activities. So when they come back to Australia, if they do, they will be punished accordingly. Gathering evidence is obviously difficult from a foreign jurisdiction, but don't underestimate the capabilities of our intelligence and law enforcement agencies. They're very focused on this. We've resourced them with an additional $600 million. Helen, we will do everything we can, whether it's through legislation, whether it's through community engagement, whether it's through greater resourcing, or in fact whether it's through the deployment of the Australian Air Force and Special Forces overseas. We will do everything possible to protect Australians here at home as well as Australian interests abroad.
Josh Frydenberg, I just want to get a final view on Ebola. Now, this is now a global humanitarian crisis that we all have to do more to solve. Do you agree?
Absolutely, and that is why Australia, was the first among many nations to make significant financial contribution to the UN fund, $18 million on top of the $40 million that we provide to the World Health Organization.
Yeah, but President Obama has welcomed American doctors and nurses going to fight it at the source. Our AMA, the Australian Medical Association, also wants the government to sanction Australian medical personnel going. Do you want to see that too?
Look, Helen, I think we've taken the appropriate action in the circumstances. We don't have the same capacity that the Americans have in terms of being able to send their military over to West Africa. The distance is a lot longer from Australia to Africa, and also in terms of the facilities that we have either on the aircrafts to deal with people who may contract the disease. So we are taking the best advice possible. You've heard from our chief public servants who are expert in this area that we are as well prepared as we can be here in Australia. We have our customs people on alert. We have our medical facilities here in Australia on alert, and Peter Dutton and Scott Morrison and Julie Bishop and all the other responsible ministers are actually doing everything possible to ensure that Australians are protected, and we can do what we can as part of an international coalition to stem the tide of Ebola.
All right, Josh Frydenberg, Parliamentary Secretary. We'll have to leave it there. Thanks so much for joining us. Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Helen. Great to be with you.
Next.